The fuel pump in this Evo has been getting very loud and whiny after only driving it for a short time, so I need to work out what's going on, as I don't want to starve the engine from fuel. To replace the fuel pump properly in an Evo 6, you need to drop the fuel tank out of the car. So in this video I'm showing all the steps I do to remove the fuel tank without a workshop lift. After the fuel tank is out, I can check it over thoroughly and install a new fuel pump and filter. If you're mainly interested in the fuel pump swap, you can skip through the video and find what you're looking for using the chapter markers. I've jacked up the car and set it down on jack stands. Then I remove the negative cable from the battery and drain both sides of the fuel tank. Then I remove the catback section of the exhaust. I'm trying to make as much room as possible to allow me to lower the fuel tank without it getting stuck, and to also protect everything from being scratched. Then I remove the rear seat and the fuel tank inspection covers. And you can see the fuel hard lines that make it impossible to replace the fuel pump with the fuel tank still attached to the car. I mark the tail shaft with a paint pen so I can reattach it later in the same position. Then I use an Allen key to hold each bolt while gradually removing the nuts with the 12mm spanner. I rotate the tail shaft to access all the nuts. And lower the tail shaft down so it's supported on a jack stand. With the 12mm socket, I remove the bolt that attaches the handbrake and wheel speed sensor cables to the chassis, and release the speed sensor cable from the connector on the side of the fuel tank, and tuck it out of the way beside the handbrake cable near the wheel. Then on the left side, I do the same by removing the bolt that attaches the handbrake and wheel speed sensor cables to the chassis. I release the speed sensor cable from the connector and unscrew the connector bracket from the floor so it can lower down with the fuel tank. Then I go back over to the right side and disconnect the fuel tank wiring harness from inside the cabin and poke it out through the floor so it can lower down with the fuel tank too. Now, to make a bit more room, I'm removing another handbrake cable and sensor mounting bolt from the right trailing arm, and the wheel speed sensor bracket sits underneath the handbrake cable bracket. Next, I'm removing the fuel tank filler hose and breather pipe. To loosen this clamp, I'm using a 10mm socket on a 1/4" drive. I'm not sure if it's possible to remove this pipe from the fuel tank end instead, but refitting this pipe later is not going to be easy with all the rear suspension and cross members in place. Then I remove the fuel filler pipe protector to get better access to the breather hose clamp. From the rear of the car, I use long nose pliers, release the clamp and push the rubber hose off the pipe as far as I can. Now I loosen the diff's front mounting bolts so I can tilt the diff down a bit to give it more room when I'm taking the fuel tank out. Now I'm disconnecting the fuel high pressure and return lines. Then I disconnect the breather line that has a clear pipe covering. The handbrake cable still wouldn't fit over the fuel lines, so I'll loosen some more brackets in front of the fuel tank and inside the cabin to create more slack in the handbrake cable, and fed it through the floor, which enables me to move the handbrake cable over the fuel tank pipes and zip tie it out of the way. So when I lower the fuel tank, the fuel pipes won't get hung up on the handbrake cable, so the tank will come out easier. I also push caps on the fuel lines to reduce drips and fuel vapor. Then I'll loosen the fuel tank mounting nuts and lower the tail shaft as much as possible. Then I realise I need to lower the tail shaft more, so I unbolt the bearing hanger and lower the tail shaft down onto a jack stand. I removed the fuel tank mounting nuts and lowered the tank a bit so I could remove the rubber fuel filler and breather hoses, but I couldn't film this on my own. Then I slid the tank forward, off the diff, and slid it backwards out of the car. With the tank on the ground, I disconnect the harness and unclip the fuel hard lines, and undo the 8mm nut that attaches the hard lines to the right side of the tank, and disconnect the siphon hose that connects the left and right side of the tank. And then I undo all the nuts on the top of the fuel pump assembly. I'm being careful with the rubber gasket as I lift the fuel pump assembly out of the tank. The pump assembly has a lot of corrosion, but it might clean up okay. And even though I've drained the fuel tank, I can still see rust particles sitting in there. And now I'm going to poke an endoscopy camera through the fuel safety valve hole and see how it looks inside the top of the tank. Unfortunately, there's rust forming just about everywhere, so that's not good. Now I'll remove the right side or fuel gauge sensor side of the tank. And it looks pretty bad in here too. I can clean it up where I can access through the inspection covers, but who knows how bad it is behind the baffles. So now I need to research if the tank can be restored, or do I need to find another one? But I do know they're no longer available new from Mitsubishi. This fuel pump assembly doesn't look too bad, but I'll clean it up with a toothbrush and scrub all the rust off it. But I might need to get some of it replated with zinc. But for the purpose of this video, I'll keep going with the fuel pump replacement job, as that needs to be done anyway. I bought a new Walbro fuel pump with an Evo fitting kit from a reputable dealer, as there are a lot of fake fuel pumps out there. Walbro is now owned by TI Automotive, so don't be surprised if your pump has that branding. But they still are made in the USA. I don't need to increase my fuel pump capacity, so I'm replacing my old Walbro with a new one. The kit comes with instructions, but if you find instructions difficult to understand, like I do, the next section will be helpful. The instructions are quite generic, and not all the parts that come with the pump and fitting kit will need to be used. First I'll remove the old pump from the L-shaped bracket with the Phillips head screwdriver, and that also releases the bracket that holds the plastic siphon nozzle against the L bracket. I use a small screwdriver to pry off the bottom part of the L bracket, which was stuck on by corrosion. With fancy pliers, I pinch the hose clamp nearest the pump and slide it down. Then I use a flat screwdriver to gently wiggle the fuel pump up and out of the rubber hose. And I take a photo to make note of the routing of the electrical wires. Then I squeeze the electrical connector and slide it off the old pump. The fuel tank gauge looks nasty, so hopefully I can buy a new one. I'm not sure why there's a sensor on the left and right side of the tank. Maybe one is for fuel level and one is a low fuel warning. Let me know in the comments if you know. There's a lot of parts that come with the new pump and fitting kit, so as I go I'll work out what is actually needed. I remove the brown cap off the pump and try not to spill the lubricant inside it. I place a new filter sock on the bottom and line it up with the little post on the pump and keep it upside down. Then I find the filter retainer and push it onto the pump, firstly with a deep socket and then with the screwdriver, and making sure that it goes on straight and on all the way. And then I slide on the foam sleeve. And push the connector onto the pump. I remove the red cap from the pump and slide the pump into the fuel hose, making sure the wiring is routed correctly, and then replace the hose clamp. I replace the rubber isolator and align it on the pump and filter sock. Sit the L bracket in position, then hold the siphon bracket in place and replace the screw. And reinstall the fuel pump assembly back into the fuel tank, which I'm only doing now to show you the steps and to stop the garage filling up with smelly fuel vapours. I don't like the idea of trying to coat the inside of this tank with a fuel sealer for a couple of reasons. The Evo tank has a lot of baffling in it, which would make it very difficult to coat it thoroughly, and I've seen simple motorcycle tanks fail with sealer. I don't know of any new Evo 6 fuel tanks available. There might be one hiding somewhere in the world, but if I had one, I certainly wouldn't sell it. Mike in Adelaide has restored Evo fuel tanks, so his service sounds like the best option. However, I do have a white Evo 6 parts car, which has rusted out chassis rails. Surely the tank would be rusted out too. So I removed its rear seat and the right hand side fuel tank inspection cover, and then I got my endoscopy camera out and attached it to my phone. And to my surprise, it looks perfect inside. So the plan now is to remove this fuel tank, inspect it thoroughly, and if it's good I'll repaint it, swap in the new fuel pump, and install it into the Tommi Makinen Evo. But that's all for today. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.